All right, welcome back to period 6 of APUSH curriculum, and today we're going to cover topic 6.11 titled Reform in the Gilded Age. So let's see what big social and political changes are being called for in the Gilded Age. Let's look at some causes and effects of those reforms. And we're going to begin by looking at some critics of the status quo. In other words, people who are critical of the way things were done in the Gilded Age, whether it's social or political or economic or all the above. And we're going to begin by talking about something called socialism. And of course, that's a word that's thrown around a lot in modern day politics, and it's one of those things that's kind of hard to pin down exactly what it is. If you ask 10 people what socialism is, you'd probably get 10 different answers. The definition we're going to use for our understanding of it is socialism is basically a political economic system in which the government is heavily involved in the economy and to ensure greater economic equality. So in socialism, you would typically see higher taxes on wealthier people. You might even see government ownership of certain businesses. You would see wealth redistribution, so taking from the top and giving to the bottom, that kind of thing. That's how we're going to describe socialism. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is there was a movement in the Gilded Age called the social gospel. And this is an interesting blend of socialism and religion. So this would involve people who were religious and felt that the government simply wasn't doing enough to tackle the big social issues of the day, things like poverty, inequality, racism, women's rights, all those things. And so they felt that the churches of America should actually step up and tackle these issues if the government wasn't going to. And these people also believe that socialism, as we've defined it, would be kind of like the ultimate version of Christianity, that they believe, their interpretation of Christ's teachings is that socialism is kind of the best path forward of equality and making sure everyone has what they need. So the social gospel followers would have fought to end child labor, because those kids, of course, need to be in school, not in a factory. They would have fought for compulsory education, so again, those kids will be in school, not in a factory or a mine or something. They wanted a shorter work day, because that would strengthen the family by having actual free time to spend with your family. And they also wanted to go after those run-down, dirty slums in the big cities, because, of course, that is where you're going to see a lot of crime and vice and everything else. And if you clean those up, then other problems will basically solve themselves. Now, let's look at a particular critic. His name is Henry George, and he was a guy who was a pretty well-known journalist and author, and we can also call him an idealist in that he really believed that society could be basically perfected. And he was a well-traveled man. He'd seen crushing poverty all around the world, even here in the United States. And he came to the conclusion that one of the key components in poverty across the world was what he called land profiteering. So land profiteering basically refers to people buying land as an investment and then later selling it for a profit. So if I buy this land at $100 and I later sell it for $150, I've made $50. That's land profiteering. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's so bad about that? Well, in his book, Progress and Poverty, which he wrote and published in 1879, he argued those profits were unearned. In other words, I didn't actually have to go out and do any physical labor. I literally just bought a piece of land and then sold it. In fact, I may have never even seen the land. I might have just bought it sight unseen and then later sold it, and I'm making money off of doing very little. And the thing about land is it's not just any other commodity like a house or like a car or something like that. Land, of course, is arguably one of the most valuable resources on planet Earth, because that's where everything comes from. That's where our food comes from, our natural resources come from. And we're not making any more of it, right? There's a finite amount. So with growing population across the world, land prices are always going to be going up, up, and up, which means, again, people are making a lot of money off of land, and the poor can't afford it. So his solution to this, and this is going to sound rather crazy at first, is he said that land sales should be taxed at 100%. 100%. So if I bought a piece of land at $100 and I sold it for $150, I would pay $150 in taxes. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. But in his mind, it does, because if you can't sell land for a profit, there's no reason to even buy it or sell it. In other words, land loses its value, and therefore it's something that will be shared equally. Much like we don't buy and sell the oxygen we breathe in the atmosphere, he believed land would become a commodity just shared by everyone. Now, of course, this is really on the fringe edge of reality. This is never going to actually take place. And even if you don't go straight to his most extreme ideas like this, there are other takeaways you could bring away from his idea and apply them to government. So he's going to be a big influence to progressive intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic. All right, another one of our writer, journalists, reformers is Edward Bellamy. And in 1880 to 1888, he published a novel called Looking Backward. And in this novel, our protagonist wakes up in the year 2000, which in 1888 seems, it's just so off in the future, it's hard to even imagine, kind of like us envisioning the year, 2100 or something. And he wakes up in the year 2000 and he finds out that all the big injustices and economic problems have basically just faded away. And the reason they've faded away is the government has taken over all big businesses. And they own the railroads, and factories, and electricity generation, all this stuff. And they own it not to run a profit, but to serve the public. Now, of course, this requires you to believe that the government is going to be perfect and always have public interest and not private interest in mind. So again, he's an idealist, just like Henry George was. Now, aside from idealism, what about actual, in the real world type reforms? And this brings us to a political party that we've actually already discussed. It's called the People's Party, but more informally known as the Populists. And the Populists had some pretty interesting demands of the government. They believed that senators should be elected directly by the people, not from state legislatures like had been done since the Constitution was adopted. They believed that inflation should occur through the coinage of silver. So in other words, we're going to make more and more silver dollars, put them into circulation, which will inflate the currency. And if you recall, the reason people like that is that will help people who are in debt. Recall the Populists were particularly favored by farmers out in the Midwest and the West, people who were often in debt and could benefit from inflation. They believed in a graduated income tax, which simply means you pay more in taxes the more you earn. And they also said that the government should own all of the big businesses. And again, we call this nationalization. It's a common theme in socialism that the government should simply control not the local mom and pop stores, but the big businesses. And in theory, that will cut down on the profit motive, and consumers will benefit. They also pushed for the 8-hour day. So if you look at what the Populists were demanding, they're going to get some of these things ultimately down the road. Some of them are kind of going to come later after the Populists are kind of gone. But if you think about the modern day, we do have direct election of senators. We do have a graduated income tax, and we do have an 8-hour day. Some of the other things, of course, are not going to come to fruition for the Populists. All right, now we're going to move on and look at some reform movements during the Gilded Age, and we're going to begin by looking at the suffrage movement. And of course, the suffrage movement was the realization that the 15th Amendment had barred your exclusion from voting based on on race, but not on gender. And so women have a big uphill battle to fight to gain the vote. And several organizations are going to pop up to fight for this, including in 1890, the famous National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA for short. And among its founding members were the famous feminists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And I've got a quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton we're going to look at and see just what her opinion of men was. So this is what Elizabeth Cady Stanton said about men in 1868. She said, "The male element is a destructive force, stern, selfish, aggrandizing, loving war, violence, conquest, acquisition, breeding in the material and moral world alike, discord, disorder, disease, and death." So she apparently had no love for men. All right, now despite opposition from men and even a lot of women, believe it or not, particularly conservative women, women did eventually gain voting rights, oftentimes starting on local matters like school boards and local health and safety boards and things like that at a local level. And of course, once that door is open, then women's voting rights will, gradually expand to other matters. In 1869, Wyoming Territory gave women suffrage. It was the first of its kind to give unrestricted suffrage for women. And in fact, Wyoming also had the very first female governor back in 1925. So Wyoming, the state that has almost nobody in it, was quite a leader in women's suffrage. Now we're going to move on to the temperance movement, something we, of course, already talked about this year. And as you can imagine, during this time period with rapid industrialization and long hours and income inequality and so forth, limiting alcohol consumption was certainly a concern because alcohol consumption makes all those other problems even worse. So that brings us to our first organization called the WCTU, the Women's Christian and Temperance Union. This is founded in 1874 by Frances E. Willard. And believe it or not, this is still an organization that's around today. I don't think they're going to get alcohol prohibited anymore, but they're still around, I guess, encouraging people to limit their alcohol consumption. Their symbol was this white ribbon of purity, right? White is pure. Another organization that's going to get established in 1893 is the Anti-Saloon League. And the thing about saloons, when you hear the word saloon, you probably think of some Old West movie, the swinging doors and the entrance and all that stuff. But saloons were all across America. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of these. And they were often in working class neighborhoods. And, the theory was if you take out the saloons, then the men who stopped there wouldn't be able to waste their money on alcohol. They wouldn't come home drunk and aggressive. And it would just take care of a lot of problems. And so they came up with some clever slogans. The saloon must go, vote for cold water, boys, and the lips that touch liquor must never touch mine. Now, on the temperance side of things, we also need to look at a particular woman, Carrie Nation. She was known as the Kansas Cyclone. Now, she had a very personal reason to be against alcohol. Her first husband basically drank himself to death, and she just, made it her life's mission to take down alcohol, and specifically the saloons. So what she would do is she would come into saloons armed with a hatchet and oftentimes also a bag of rocks. And she would go in there and she would just tear the place up. You can see here, barroom smasher, Carrie Nation. And she was arrested, over 24 times for these incidents. She called them her hatchetations, where she would go after the saloon and just chop the place up and break things. How helpful is this to the temperance cause? Probably not at all. In fact, it's probably actually counterproductive, because well-meaning people would look at Carrie Nation and say, well, gosh, temperance must be just full of crazy people. I'm not going to support them. So again, she's actually probably not helping at all her case. There's you can see Carrie Nation in this political cartoon. Check out the title on this cartoon. It says, "A Suggestion to the Buffalo Exposition. Let us have a chamber of female horrors." And you can see Susan B. Anthony there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and you've got there Carrie Nation. All right, one more woman to look at. It's a woman who was very famous in her time because of how controversial she was. But for whatever reason, it's a name that's kind of fallen through the cracks in history, and very few people in the modern era have ever heard of Victoria Woodhull. So Victoria Woodhull was a very outspoken voice for feminism. She believed women should be doing everything that men were doing, right? She was buying and selling stocks on Wall Street. She was divorced, and, in this time period, to be divorced was exceptionally rare, especially to brag about it openly. In 1871, she even went so far as to declare her belief in what she called free love. And that's a term we've looked at already with the Oneida Colony back in the Utopian movement. Basically, this means that traditional marriage as we see it really shouldn't exist. Free love says basically people could pair up as they see fit. There really shouldn't be monogamy. And, of course, in the 1870s, to profess something like that was beyond scandalous, right? In 1872, she made history by being the first woman to run for president. Of course, she's not going to get much in the way of votes, but she set the precedent there that women could be active in economics and politics and social matters. All right, guys, that's it for our reform movements of the Gilded Age. So make sure you look over those big names and big organizations, over the temperance movement, suffrage movement, and women's rights, and all those other things.